A culture that thinks that comic books and comic book movies are profound meditations on the human condition is a dumb f***ing culture.
I were going to a desert island and I could not take actual books. I suppose I would take Neil Gaiman's Sandman because it's the most deeply intellectual and constantly renewing comic. It's always a little bit different. You always learn something new.
Writing comic books has made me a better plotter for my novels.
This guy that's on my shirt, it was Scott's concept that the vampire should look like this depraved Kurt Cobain.
And then I write thrillers and mysteries like The Inner Circle. That's my living. That's what I do, is I write mysteries for a living. But I get to write Batman and Superman. They asked me to do that because I just love those characters.
Hey comic book fans, Kevin Given here once again with Comics Let's Talk, and I want to respond to Bill Maher's statements recently on Stan Lee and comic books in general. As a lifelong comic book fan, I take offense to Bill Maher's recent blog concerning the death of Stan Lee and comic books in general. For those who don't know what he said, I'll read a portion of it. This is from the 4WWL website. America is in mourning, deep, deep mourning for a man who inspired millions to, I don't know, watch a movie, I guess. Maher's post continued, saying he has nothing against comic books, but that when he was growing up, comics were for kids. And when you grew up, you moved on to big boy books without the pictures. But then 20 years or so ago, something happened. Adults decided that they didn't have to give up kid stuff, he said, and so they pretended comic books were actually sophisticated literature.
I'm agnostic on Stan Lee. I don't read comic books. I didn't even read them when I was a child. What I was saying is a culture that thinks that comic books and comic book movies are profound meditations on the human condition is a dumb f***ing culture. And for people to get mad at that just proves my point.
Then the late night host brought politics into the mix, mentioning President Donald Trump. I don't think it's a huge stretch to suggest that Donald Trump could only get elected in a country that thinks comic books are important, Maher wrote. Now, I'm not going to touch on the political aspects of Maher's statements. I don't care if you're for or against President Trump. So I just want to leave that part of it alone. I want to concentrate on comics in general. Other sites have already made comments about Frank Miller and Alan Moore, among others who have used the medium of comics to deliver incredible material and stories that aren't for kids. Maher admits that he doesn't read comics or know that much about them, so why the condescending tone when it comes to that particular type of literature? Now, I'm not going to sit here and call Maher a bunch of names, as I've heard on other YouTube videos, despite Maher's tendency to call people he doesn't like or agree with derogatory names himself. But my question to Mr. Maher is, what do you enjoy for entertainment? Do you find classic literature to be important? How about sports? Do you watch football, baseball, basketball? What makes your type of entertainment important and why? Now, I'm not going to sit here and diss other forms of entertainment either, whether Maher likes them or not. A lot of people like sports and a lot don't. But what I want to do is show anyone who is skeptical of comic books and their art how this form of entertainment is important to a lot of us. I personally would not be able to read anywhere near as well as I can if it weren't for comics. I used to have my mother read them to me. I got Fantastic Four number 48 and flipped through it as a kid, and I was determined to learn how to read those word balloons and find out what was going on. On this show today, I'm going to show you a couple of artists that drew for comic books and look at 2 top 10 lists. Literary artists who have written for comics, and graphic novels, comics not written for kids. One celebrated artist that used comic book art in his work was Georgios Ioannou, 1926 to 2017. He was a Greek artist born in Athens. He is considered to have been one of the main representatives of the pop art movement in Greece. In his work, by adopting the main aspects of pop art and utilizing the techniques employed by comic books, he turned to satirizing social and political reality, creating compositions with a surrealistic atmosphere and symbolic illusions. Another famous pop artist is Michael Mobius from eBay, Mobius Art website. Michael Mobius came into the world in 1968. In the city of Perna, Germany. Having developed a love for art at an early age, cartooning became his first passion. But in the then communist East Germany, more pragmatic pursuits were the order of the day. Art would have to be put on the back burner for a while, as formal education was pursued, and Michael decided on a career in engineering and construction. It was during a stint working in the parallel field of architectural illustration that Michael happened upon a book featuring the pinups of Alberto Vargas. A new love affair took root, and Michael decided that figurative art would be his life's work. He started studying painting at the Academy of Arts in Dresden, and in 1998 he got a big breakthrough. It was at this time, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that Michael was able to make his way to the United States. His talent as a painter and photographer was readily apparent. He quickly became a sought-after favorite of collectors. Michael has already been part of major exhibitions throughout the U.S. His collector and base and publishers include Playboy, Procter & Gamble, Laura Biagatti, Vogue, Vanity Fair, and other well-known companies. These are highly respected artists who have contributed to the medium of comic books. And I'm reminded of the movie Unbreakable from M. Night Shyamalan with Bruce Willis and Samuel L. Jackson. Jackson's character of Elijah Price owns an art gallery which features comic book art. An admirer is interested in buying a certain piece which Price describes in detail.
Fritz Campion's own library. This is before the first issue of the comic book hit the stands in 1968. It's a classic depiction of good versus evil. Notice the square jaw of Slayer, common in most comic heroes, and the slightly disproportionate size of Jaguaro's head to his body. This again is common, but only in villains. The thing to notice about this piece, the thing that makes it very, very special, is its realistic depiction of its figures. When the characters reached the magazine, they were exaggerated, as always happens. This is a vintage.
Then he finds out that the patron wants to buy it for his 4-year-old son and becomes upset. He then lectures the patron. Do you see any Teletubbies in here? Do you see a slender plastic tag clipped to my shirt with my name printed on it? Do you see a little Asian child with a blank expression on his face sitting outside on the mechanical helicopter that shakes when you put quarters in it? No? Well, that's what you see at a toy store. And you must think you're in a toy store because you're here shopping for an infant named Jeb. This is an art gallery, my friend, and this is a piece of art. And now let's look at our first top 10 list. From Newsrama in 2013, 10 prose authors turned comic book prose. Newsrama notes that there are at least 10 noted authors that have written for the medium of comic books. At number 10, Marjorie Liu.
A comic book is, generally speaking, about 20 pages long, and half the burden is carried by your artist. And so you write the script, and you describe, you write the story, you write the script, the lettering, all that. But then your job is done, and you have an artist there who picks up half the burden, who is responsible for creating the world and creating that visual element. Whereas when you're writing a novel, you are responsible for painting the world and for making sure the reader can live in it. And so the responsibility is huge, and it's all on you. And it's definitely an endurance race because a novel is 100,000 words, between 70,000 to 100,000 words, about 400 pages, and that's a lot different. It's definitely a different beast.
Before Marjorie Liu started writing for Marvel with 2008's NYX No Way Home, she was already an established novelist with multiple paranormal romance series under her belt, as well as an X-Men prose novel. No surprise then that she's taken the X books by storm, having written NYX, X-23, Dark Wolverine, and Astonishing X-Men so far. Even as she continues to guide the destinies of Northstar, Karma et al., and Astonishing, she stayed active in prose. At number 9, we're looking at Paul Cornell. And Paul came into prominence as a novelist and television writer before he broke into the comics mainstream with 2007's Wisdom for Marvel. In fairness, he'd contributed to both Doctor Who magazine and Judge Dredd magazine when starting out as a writer. But it was his work on Doctor Who New Adventures novel series and later the BBC Doctor Who revamp that made his reputation. Although he's currently in charge of Wolverine's future in the Marvel title of the same name, Cornell remains active in the prose world, having recently published the urban fantasy London Falling. At number 8 is Chris Robertson. Chris Robertson is a man of many talents. You may know him as the writer of iZombie, Masks, and Edison Rex, not to mention the writer who finished what J. Michael Straczynski started on the grounded storyline for Superman, or as the co-publisher of critically acclaimed digital imprint Monkey Brain. At number 7, we're looking at Duane Swierczynski, one of a wave of crime novelists who broke into Marvel in the mid-2000s. Duane Swierczynski had worked his way up through non-fiction titles like The Big Book o' Beer and The Perfect Drink for Every Occasion to thrillers and including The Blonde and The Wheelman, before bringing us his particular take on the world of comics. After starting with relatively grounded titles like Moon Knight and The Punisher, he's found himself branching out with other publishers, writing Bloodshot for Valiant and Godzilla for IDW. Next up, Point and Shoot, Charlie Hardy trilogy, due later this year. What you possibly don't know is that he's also responsible for a plethora of prose works, including both original novels, like the Celestial Empire series and End of the Century, and licensed works, including Star Trek, X-Men, and even Spy Kids. Clearly, the next step is taking over the world of poetry. At number 6, we're looking at Greg Rucka, one of the most well-known novelists slash comic writers in the business. Rucka had already created the Atticus Kodiak series of novels by the time he started working with Steve Lieber to create Whiteout for Oni Comics. That, in turn, led to a long career at DC Comics, where at one point he was writing ongoing series for both Superman and Wonder Woman, and a Batman mini, simultaneously, and Marvel. But he's always kept his hand on characters that he's created, whether in Queen and Country or Stumptown in print comics, Lady Saber and the Pirates of the Ineffable Aether in webcomics, or the Alpha trilogy of novels started last year. At number 5, we're looking at Brad Meltzer.
I love them for what they stand for. To me, the most important part of the story is not Superman. The most important part of the story is Clark Kent. And you want to know why? Because we're all Clark Kent. We all know what it's like to be boring and ordinary and wish we could do something incredibly beyond ourselves. And that, to me, is what I love.
Few writers get you into the comic industry with quite the splash that Brad Meltzer managed. First following Kelvin Smith on Green Arrow, and then writing the massively successful Identity Crisis event for DC Comics. Let's credit that impact to the fact that Meltzer had already honed his craft and built up quite a fan base through novels like The Tenth Justice and The Millionaires before coming to comics. These days he continues to expand his horizons, whether on TV with the History Channel's Decoded, or in non-fiction books like last year's Heroes for My Daughter. At number 4, we're looking at Jonathan Lethem. That MacArthur Fellowship winner Lethem, as a comic fan, came as no surprise. In addition to his genre-friendly books, he's previously written about the fandom for Star Wars and Philip K. Dick, after all. But if that level of nerdity wasn't enough of a clue, there's also the title of his 2003 novel, The Fortress of Solitude. But it took 2007's revival of Steve Gerber and Mary Screen's Omega the Unknown to bring the writer into the comic medium, creating a series with artist Farrell Dalrymple that was everything fans of both the writer and the character would have expected. Something poignant, uncertain, and quite beautiful. With his latest novel, Dissident Gardens, due later this year, would it be too much to ask that we might see some more comics from him before too long? Number 3, Michael Chabon, award-winning author whose geekdom was rarely in doubt. The Pulitzer Prize-winning The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, about comic creators at the beginning of the industry, put such questions to bed for good. Chabon went from fan to creator when Dark Horse Comics spun out the escapist Cavalier and Clay's fictional creation into his own comic book, overseen and partly written by the author. Although he's concentrated on prose since the end of the series, his comic book career is due to restart later next year, after it was announced that he'll write backup strips for the next series of Matt Fraction, Fabio Moon, and Gabriel Baz Casanova. The number 2 author we're looking at is Stephen King.
Now, with American Vampire, there were 2 of us that worked on the book. There was Scott Snyder and there was me. Scott explained this whole thing to me about what he was going to do. And this guy that's on my shirt, it was Scott's concept that the vampire should look like this depraved Kurt Cobain. So that was what Raphael Albuquerque drew him to look like. And he's sort of hanging out by the pool and talking with these girls and chatting them up. But there's no sense, I didn't get any sense in the early issues that he had anything more in mind other than they're cute chicks, I want to talk to them. And later he develops a kind of protective thing toward Pearl, a little bit like Abby does in Let Me In. Mm-hmm. Abby, right?
Yes.
I said it right this time. I'm getting old. But in my story, where Skinner Sweet is the origin story. He's a cowboy, an outlaw in the Old West, and he is killed and gets a drop of this evil Eurovamp's blood in his eye, and it eventually turns him.
Stephen King is an astonishingly successful, with more than 50 novels under his belt, prolific author. King has dipped his toe into comic books a handful of times during his career. Outside of his contribution to the 1985 charity anthology Heroes for Hope, King also wrote Creepshow, the Bernie Wrightson illustrated adaptation of the George A. Romero movie, and more recently, one of the 2 stories that made up the opening arc of Scott Snyder's American Vampire over at Vertigo. There are also numerous Dark Tower and Stand titles over at Marvel, although those those are adaptations by other writers of his prose books. With King's experimenting more with different formats in recent years, he's working on plays, novels, and ebooks these days. How long before someone convinces him to go it alone on an all-new, all-original comic book work? And the #1 author that's worked on comic books on our list is Harlan Ellison.
These are some of the comics that I have written. You may recognize the title, The Avengers. They're the Hulk, fairly well known. And I wrote those. My name is right there on the cover, as you can see.
As is befitting such an outspoken writer, Harlan Ellison's comic book output can be considered somewhat eclectic, having produced original material for issues of Detective Comics, The Spirit, The Incredible Hulk, Avengers, and Daredevil throughout the years, seemingly whenever inspiration strikes. He's also had more than one comic book anthology devoted to adapting his prose. Harlan Ellison's Dream Corridor and the illustrated Harlan Ellison spring to mind.
This is where I keep the comic books. This is where Harlan Ellison's Dream Corridor comes from. This is my baby. And every issue, I am the host. I lead the viewer into the Dream Corridor.
And even offered an illustrated to a 1989 charity title called Fire Sale. His next big comic book project is due soon, the graphic novel Harlan Ellison's 7 Against Chaos, illustrated by Paul Chadwick, which was released in July. And our next top 10 list from listverse.com. For decades, the comic book industry, at least the mainstream book industry, was targeted exclusively towards juveniles. Over the last 30 years, however, the industry has grown up, and more books are written with adult readers in mind. A lot of these books are written by very talented individuals and are very fun to read. Unfortunately, a large segment of what's out there is largely what is termed escapist literature, and like most genre fiction, fails to amount to anything more than just an enjoyable read. This isn't because the medium itself is limited or inferior. However, the medium has already produced several masterpieces rich in depth. This is a list of the top 10 works which are not great comic books to read, but comic books which, in terms of literary merit, could easily go toe-to-toe with the greatest works in literature and film. Several authors in this list have written multiple works which could easily make the list. I've limited this list to only one work, the very best by each author. At number 10, Spider-Man Loves Mary Jane from Sean McKeever, Takeshi Miyazawa, and David Hahn. The Mary Jane comics are one of Marvel's many attempts to appeal to the preteen, teen girl demographic. It's one of the few times that the comic book industry as a whole has tried to succeed in creating an entertaining comic targeting young girls that wasn't horribly sexist. The comic itself takes place in an alternate version of the Marvel Universe, where Mary Jane Watson and Gwen Stacy went to high school with Norman Osborn, Peter Parker, Flash Thompson, and Liz Allen. Despite occurring within a superhero-infested universe, the book has very little superhero fare. Spider-Man makes few appearances and is presented largely as an unrealistic celebrity crush of Mary Jane's until very late into the comic's run. The comic is largely centered around the typical teenage problems experienced by Mary Jane and her friends, particularly problems involving teenage dating and crushes. Thankfully, Mary Jane completely shies away from the more complex social issues facing teens, like teenage sex and drug abuse, subjects that works of this nature seem drawn to and typically tackle in simplistic, unrealistic, and condescending ways. At a glance, the book does seem to lack any real depth, but if you give it a chance, it does actually have a lot to say, particularly concerning teenage romance. And even if you're not a teenage girl, the book's still a fun read. McKeever has written some of the most amazing and delightful dialogue to ever appear in comic books. The characters are all deep and well drawn out, while remaining average, immature, angst-ridden teens. What really sets McKeever's comic apart, though, is that he manages to perfectly capture how it feels to be a teenager and what most of us went through when we first started developing romantic feelings. At number 9, A Superman for All Seasons by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale. A Superman for All Seasons is a retelling of Superman's beginnings, dealing with Clark Kent's transition from a teenager in Smallville to his early days as Superman in Metropolis. Each of the 4 books that make up the series is dedicated to a different season in which it takes place, and the ideas and symbolism of each season correspond to what Superman happens to be going through and what is happening in his life. Symbolism of the season and the cycle of nature is hardly new in literature, but luckily in this instance it's handled well by a more than capable author. The end result is a coming-of-age story that's rich in symbolism and themes and is also an entertaining read. The book was the main inspiration for the Smallville television show. And number 8, it's Lucifer Lucifer is a spin-off of Neil Gaiman's The Sandman comic book, centered around Gaiman's interpretation of Satan. Arguably the most interesting character in his book, and one of the most interesting depictions of Satan since Paradise Lost. In Sandman, Lucifer realized he had been deceived. He had never been the rebel he thought himself to be, but was instead nothing more than just a pawn in God's master plan. So to truly rebel, he quit as ruler of hell, kicking everyone out before he left. By the end of the Sandman comic book, Lucifer was running a nightclub, Lux, in Los Angeles. Carrie's Lucifer picks up right where Gaiman leaves off, and initially the book seems to be largely modeled after Sandman, but very quickly it becomes clear that where Sandman took one of his powers of the universe and dealt with his day-to-day life and relationships, Lucifer is a true fantasy epic with larger-than-life characters involved in wars that will determine the fate of the universe. With its interesting characters and epic storylines, Lucifer is a fun read. So much so, it seems like nothing more than a fun read until you reach the end. Then you realize just how deep the work actually is, themed largely around the idea of pedestrianization versus free will. At number 7, we're looking at Hitman by Garth Ennis. Tommy Monahan is arguably the best hitman in Gotham City, although he only kills other criminals. After being infected with an alien-engineered plague, he gains X-ray vision and telepathy and decides to specialize in doing hits on other superhumans and demons. He first appears in Demon Annual, which is his origin story, and later appears in 2 other storylines in Demon. He then appears in Batman Chronicles before getting his own series. Several years later, Ennis did a 2-part JLA Hitman miniseries that serves as a sort of epilogue. The earlier stories featuring Tommy and Demon are important to read because later stories draw on events that occur in them, but the story doesn't start to hit its stride until Hitman number 1. It's hard to say exactly what Hitman's about or what makes it stand out because there are so many different things, most of which alone could have gotten Hitman on the list. The comic deals with characters deeply entrenched and moving through various crime syndicates in Gotham City, an aspect of the DC universe that is rarely seen. The characters themselves are for the most part ordinary people, oftentimes commenting on popular culture and treating current events in the DC universe much the same as comic book fans, e.g. being upset about Superman's long hair or making crude sexual remarks about the Catwoman. The book declamorizes criminal life and has themes covering the inaccuracies of history, the nature of death, and how niceness and ethics are different from being a good person. At number 6, The Sandman by Neil Gaiman. The Sandman deals with the life and times of Dream of the Endless, one of the 7 immortal powers that act on the universe and routinely deal with gods, angels, demons, and other supernatural beings. Drawing heavily from the horror and suspense comics, Sandman paints a portrait of Dream through a series of seemingly disconnected stories, sometimes having Dream as the central protagonist, but other times having him do as little as a cameo appearance. However, the stories ultimately connect back together through various characters and themes. Another signature of Gaiman's Sandman was pulling obscure characters from DC's past and incorporating them into their stories. One of the first things that stands out about Sandman is it revolves around a being of epic stature, Dream, but the majority of the stories are centered around his personal life and relationships. From there, the Sandman goes on to explore the idea of stories, mythology, and folklore, their role in the world, and the role of the storyteller, and in doing so modernizes and retells many classic stories from mythology and history, incorporating them into the Sandman universe. In the end, the story deals specific with character arcs and the necessity for change within our characters and within the universe. At number 5, we're looking at Animal Man from Grant Morrison. Animal Man is an atypical superhero. He supports Greenpeace, PETA, and animal rights in general. He wants to be a superhero and he wants to be able to make a living doing it, but he also dislikes violence. That isn't to say that he's against killing someone in a fit of vengeful rage or accidentally joining a violent animal rights group. He isn't even beyond something as simple as making a snap decision that he and his family are going vegetarian without thinking it through or even discussing it with his wife. Animal Man is a good and moral person with big ideals, but at the same time he's far from being perfect and, like most people, prone to making mistakes and letting his emotions take control of him. Morrison is known for being one of the writers to first introduce higher literary devices into comics. Animal Man is the first serious work of postmodern metafiction in mainstream comics. The Psycho Pirate is regurgitating old comics from our world in an attempt to bring back the characters erased from continuity during the Crisis on Infinite Earths. Animal Man takes peyote and sees the reader reading the comic book, and ultimately Animal Man ends up on a quest to seek out what is rightfully believes to be a supreme being. Grant Morrison, despite the fact that the book is very clear that it is just a comic book, the characters and their stories are still incredibly engaging and remain important to the reader. Plus, if you can read the entire series and get through the final book without crying, you have no soul. At number 4, Superman Red Sun by Mark Millar. appearing in Superman Red Sun number 1 through 3. What if Superman landed on Earth 12 hours later? Red Sun takes place in an alternate universe where that has happened. Now, instead of landing on a farm in Kansas and being raised to uphold truth, justice, and the American way of life, he lands on a Siberian farm and is raised to uphold the ideals of communism, the workers' revolution, and Marxist philosophies. Lana Lang is a Siberian farm girl. Pete Ross is the illegitimate son of Stalin, and Bruce Wayne is an anti-Soviet terrorist. Meanwhile, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, and Lex Luthor are all still born in the United States. Red Sun is the first Superman work to question the idea of Superman. In the past, Lex Luthor has been allowed to express his views about how Superman is holding humanity back and that he is too powerful of a being, but only so that Superman could reveal Luthor's perspective to be wrong and derived from pettiness. Red Sun considers that Luthor may be right and paints him as the hero. Meanwhile, Superman's character is largely unchanged, holding steadfast to a national philosophy that he considers righteous and moral and endeavoring to better the world and save lives. However, he does so with the philosophy that the Western world has long since determined to be, at best, unrealistic and oppressive, and at worst, evil. At number 3, we're looking at Identity Crisis by Brad Meltzer. Someone knows the secret identities of all the superheroes. Now they're targeting and killing their loved ones. That is essentially the plot to Identity Crisis. Major DC heroes like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman have small, almost cameo appearances in the story. The major characters are all lesser known and less popular DC characters like the Elongated Man, Green Arrow, and the Atom. The story is a classic whodunit, with the DC superheroes and the reader trying to figure out who would kill the families of superheroes and why. It also takes from modern crime dramas, showing the superhero equivalent of CSI-style investigations. But if you scratch the surface, there's a much deeper story hidden within Identity Crisis. The story is centered on death and how it operates, what it does to us, and ultimately why the people we love have to die. The comic uses the rich and detailed story of the DC Universe, its characters, and their relationships to fully make its points. A feat that couldn't be accomplished without these already developed characters, some of which have existed for nearly 80 years. As much as that adds to the story, that is also the one major shortcoming of Identity Crisis. The story is so tied up in the DC characters and their histories that without a decent understanding of the DC Universe, many of the themes become lost, and at times, the story is even difficult to follow. At number 2, The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller. People have gotten tired of superhero vigilantes. Superman is the last active hero, working in secret for the U.S. government. The others have all retired of their own volition, or they've been forced into retirement by Superman. As the crime rates rise in Gotham City and Two-Face is released from prison, the 59-year-old Bruce Wayne decides to come out of retirement and once again become Batman, ultimately leading to a fight to the death between Batman and Superman. Upon its release, this comic was ill received by the mainstream press because of its darker portrayals of Batman and Superman, but has since come to be regarded as not only one of the most important and influential Batman books, but one of the most important and influential comic books ever written. With The Dark Knight Returns, DC was once again trying to revitalize the popular Batman character for the modern era. In revamping the Batman character, Miller opted to show a more realistic version of Batman, but instead of changing Batman's history for the sake of realism, Miller instead looked for reasons for Batman's actions that made sense. For instance, he painted a bright target on his chest because he can't put Kevlar on his head. Beyond simply deconstructing Batman through this comic, the comic also explored the deeper themes of how the role we're meant to play changes as we grow older, elitism and the place superior people should hold in society, and the nature of superheroes and what they really mean to us. And the number 1 graphic novel or trade paperback that was not written for children, The Watchmen by Alan Moore. How could any other title have made the number 1 spot? It is better regarded than any other comic book in history. It has won numerous awards. It was the only comic book included in Time's list of the 100 greatest novels of all time. And it is the most popular work written by a man who is considered by most to be the greatest living comic book author. Moore started by taking the idea of what it would really be like if superheroes existed. What he ended up with was sexual deviancy, homosexuality, vigilantism, political and national exploitation, men and women who feel they are above the law, and a public that ultimately scorns their existence. The work itself is meant as a deconstruction of the superhero story, and anybody who's read a lot of criticism on literature or film knows that critics and academia alike adore deconstructions. Although it is the first real deconstruction of the superhero genre, That in and of itself is not that great of a feat. Moore, however, goes one step further and deconstructs Nietzsche's Superman, a philosophy which more so than any other has been tied into the idea of the superhero. Moore presents us with 4 different Supermen, all conforming to Nietzsche's ideal and each following the ethics of a different school of philosophy. We then see what becomes of Supermen when they exist outside theory or the idealized world typically found in comic books, and more importantly, what they do to the society they exist in. And that was our look at my response to Bill Maher's comments on Stan Lee and comic books in general. And there's a special shout out we forgot to mention in both of these lists. Clive Barker has also written for the medium of comic books his own Hellraiser characters for Boom Studios Comics. If you love comics as much as I do, you're going to subscribe to my channel. That was our show for this week, True Believer. I hope you enjoyed it. Come on back next week for another episode of Comics Let's Talk. Until then, keep reading those comics.